Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, and welcome to another weekend book review. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
We've noticed a lot of you are tuning in, which is amazing, but I haven't quite hit that subscribe button yet.
Yeah, and that little button, honestly, it's so small, but it makes such a huge difference in helping us reach more people with these important discussions.
Right. It's true. Like the algorithms, those mysterious forces that decide what we all see and hear, they pay a lot of attention to subscriber numbers.
Yeah, think of it like the subscribing. It's like casting a vote for quality content, So these insightful research discussions don't just get lost in the sea of all the information out there.
More subscribers equals more visibility, right? And that means more resources for us to make even deeper dives for you.
Yeah.
Maybe bring in experts for interviews, even do some live Q&A sessions where you can jump in.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about building a community around research,
Yeah.
where curiosity thrives and knowledge is like shared and debated.
Okay, so you seriously can't scroll through like any social media right now without running into it.
Right. This whole Ghibli explosion.
Yeah, exactly. It's just insane. It's like, I don't know, the moment that OpenAI, dropped that new image generator thing on ChatGPT, the entire internet was like, okay, we're all living in a Miyazaki movie now.
Apparently. It is kind of amazing how fast it took off.
Right. It's just like everywhere you look, it's these super beautiful, seriously gorgeous, like Ghibli-style portraits just popping up all over the place.
Even Sam Altman, the founder of ChatGPT, he even weighed in on it.
Oh, yeah. What did he say?
He was talking about GPU meltdown, because, the servers are getting slammed.
I bet. Everyone's trying to make, their Spirited Away selfie or something. Right?
It's really captured people's imagination.
Well, it's so cool. But, I kind of think this isn't just like a silly internet thing that'll disappear next week, right?
No, I agree.
I feel like there's something kind of deeper about why Studio Ghibli, has this lasting appeal. It's not just, pretty animation.
Exactly. It's become, it's like a cultural touchstone.
Right. For so many people all over the place.
Totally. And what's really fascinating to me is when you dig a little deeper, you start to see all these connections and influences you wouldn't expect. It's not just some isolated, artistic island.
Right.
It's woven into technology. It's woven into business, global culture even. In ways that, you wouldn't immediately think about.
Okay, so let's really get into this then, right? Because for this deep dive, we're not just going to be scrolling through the memes.
Right.
Our mission here is to go beyond this viral moment, I guess, and really try to understand, the deeper history and the broader significance of Studio Ghibli. We want to look at it as more than just this, magical animation studio that kind of exists in its own little bubble.
Right, because when we look at it through what we might call an industrial lens, seeing it not just as a creative entity, but as a business working within a larger network of companies, technologies, and economic forces. That's when it gets really interesting.
Okay, so explain that a little more. What do you mean like an industrial lens?
Well, there's this great book, Studio Ghibli, An Industrial History, and it really helps us do just that. It unpacks how this manufacturing of fantasy, as the book puts it, is really supported by big corporate relationships and this whole global network.
So you're saying even for something that feels like purely artistic, like a Ghibli film, there are all these real world, industrial forces at play.
Precisely. Think about it. Pixar, right? They played a huge role in getting a lot of those films dubbed for audiences here.
Oh, yeah.
And Guillermo del Toro, who's obviously a major figure in, contemporary cinema, he hosted that big Ghibli retrospective, generated a ton of buzz. Even the Academy Museum, they used their Miyazaki exhibit to, highlight their own global ambitions.
So it's not just casual, I like Ghibli. These are, strategic moves within, these huge cultural industries.
Exactly. It positions Studio Ghibli not just as this creative force, but as this major cultural institution.
Okay, so it helps us understand the films, but it also helps us understand Ghibli's role in, global culture.
Exactly. And it allows us to think about, not just the films themselves, but their branding, their promotion, even their short films, which often get overlooked.
Oh, that's interesting. And the book talks about Hayao Miyazaki himself, too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Not just, the director, but, studio founder, producer, screenwriter. He was even involved in designing the studio buildings.
Which is amazing, right? It shows you the scope of his involvement. It goes way beyond that typical idea of the auteur. You know, that whole, the director is the only creative force, like an author of a book.
Yeah, I get it.
As the book points out, his many roles within the studio are key to understanding how Ghibli really functions. I mean, think about it. He's not just coming up with these worlds. He's actively involved in, you know, their physical creation, down to the architecture.
Wow. I mean, that level of like personal investment across so many areas, that's going to have a huge impact, right, on the studio's whole identity and the work they make.
For sure. And it encourages us to consider like the work of other scholars who've, you know, moved beyond just the Miyazaki as a genius approach to understanding Ghibli. People like Shiro Yoshioka, who's looked at how they promote their films and, you know, present themselves to the public. And Helen McCarthy, who, you know, early on really highlighted the production processes, the industrial partners, and all the other creative people who shaped Ghibli in those early years.
So it's more than just focusing on like the individual brilliance. It's about understanding the whole like ecosystem.
Exactly.
The network of people, businesses, technologies, all of that.
Mm-hmm. And that includes, you know, the wider context, the Japanese animation industry as a whole.
Oh, right. It's easy to forget they're not the only ones.
They're not operating in a vacuum at all. I mean, Japan has hundreds of animation studios, each with their own history and, you know, their own ways of doing things.
Wow.
So when you put Ghibli in that local context, their success is even more remarkable. I mean, it's a really competitive market.
Yeah, it's easy to just see like the global phenomenon and forget that.
Right.
And the book mentions too, there wasn't like just one single way of doing anime in Japan either. You had these like independent animators, experimental groups.
Exactly. You had like these diverse modes of animation. You know, stop motion artists like Kiichiro Kawamoto and Tadanari Okamoto, who even like came up with their own ways of distributing their work. And then you had avant-garde collectives like the Animation Association of Three.
Wow, I've never even heard of that one.
And even, you know, someone as groundbreaking as Osamu Tezuka with his pioneering work in television animation at Lushi Production. Yeah. That was just one part of this much, much larger and, you know, more diverse creative landscape.
So Ghibli kind of emerges out of this really rich history. Mm-hmm. And the way that anime gets out to audiences has changed so much too, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
You know, from like early cinema to television. And now it's this whole complex world of streaming and all these different media formats.
Right. And it's fascinating how it's become integrated into what people call the contents industry, right?
Contents industry.
It's this idea that anime is designed to be spread across, you know, all these platforms. It's a huge shift from the early days of film in Japan. Now you have this web of television, home video, production companies, and audiences. Mm-hmm. And the book points out that some scholars, people like Daryl William Davis and Emily Yayuso, see it as part of this even wider screen industry.
What's that?
You know, it includes film, video games, publishing, practically everything we watch.
It's almost like they knew the future, right? With how everything's connected now.
Well, and it makes sense when you see how these anime franchises expand into all these different media.
That's true.
And the book even mentions that a lot of these studios, they don't actually see big profits until the home video release, which might explain why they've been developing more original films and adapting existing works.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just a creative decision, it's also an economic one.
Totally. You know, studios like Kyoto Animation, they've built this like super loyal fan base over time. And they've transitioned from mainly doing outsourced animation to, you know, making their own projects. And it's a really interesting system, the anime studio system. I mean, new studios are always popping up. Older ones struggle. Sometimes even really successful creators like Hideaki Anno, they decide to go out on their own.
Right, with Studio Kara.
Exactly. So it's this dynamic and, you know, it's sometimes kind of precarious ecosystem.
I can imagine. The book mentions that a lot of these successful studios, they were built around like big name creators.
Yeah, for sure. From Yoshida to Tezuka to obviously Miyazaki.
But it also makes it clear that it's not just about one person, right? It's about these larger production networks.
Absolutely. And, you know, when we focus specifically on Studio Ghibli's origins, the book really challenges some of those commonly held beliefs. You know, it wasn't just Miyazaki, Takahata, and Suzuki.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the role of Tokuma Publishing, this major media company, and a guy named Toru Hara in the early corporate leadership, they often get overlooked.
Oh, so Nausicaa, the Valley of the Winds.
Yeah.
That was definitely huge for them. That gave them the, you know, the push to start their own studio, right?
Oh, definitely a pivotal moment. But it wasn't quite as simple as two creative geniuses just, you know, deciding to go it alone. The book reveals a much more, complicated industrial reality. Studio Ghibli was really closely tied to Tokuma Publishing's bigger business goals in the early days. It even started kind of unexpectedly as this project Tokuma placed on Suzuki, Takahata, Hara, and Miyazaki. Yeah. And their first film, Castle in the Sky, it had to carry a lot of financial weight. It wasn't until the success of Kiki's Delivery Service that they became, truly financially stable. It's amazing to think that this studio, that's inspiring millions of people online right now with its gorgeous aesthetic, had such, precarious beginnings. It really makes you realize how much more there is to the story than just the magic on screen.
Wow. That's a lot to think about. It's like a totally different picture than, the romanticized idea of just pure artistic creation.
Exactly.
And speaking of romanticized ideas, the book even quotes Davis and scholars we talked about before.
Yeah.
They suggest that Ghibli's unconventionality, that it might actually just prove the ultra commercialism of Japanese media.
That's such a good point.
Yeah, I mean, how can something so unique be considered ultra commercial? So it's kind of a paradox.
Right, but it's this idea that even Ghibli's unique artistic identity, what we see as exceptional, it's actually rooted in the commercial realities of, the media industry.
And the author of the book, they argue that there's a lot of myth-making around Ghibli. The story of its founding, their feminist themes, their use of, traditional animation.
Which is why this whole industrial history approach is so valuable, right?
Yeah.
It tries to look beyond the myths.
By looking at the context, the collaborations, the technologies, all these wider forces that have shaped Ghibli. And the author mentions Janet Wasco's work on Disney as a key influence.
Oh, interesting.
Highlighting those parallels, even direct connections between Disney and Ghibli, their distribution agreements.
So it's almost like applying that same, multifaceted analysis used for Disney to Ghibli.
Precisely.
And using, the principles of political economy to see how the systems of production and ownership influence what gets made and how it's received by audiences.
Exactly.
So it's not just about the films, it's about the whole context around them. Yeah. And unlike a lot of other studios, Ghibli has made a lot of information about their internal operations public, through documentaries and those archive books they put out.
Yeah, it's true.
And I think the amount of historical information we have about and even directly from Ghibli is really remarkable. Being so closely tied to a publishing company like Tokuma and having someone like Toshio Suzuki in a key leadership role, with his background in journalism, that has profoundly shaped their public image and the stories we tell about them.
Okay, so there's a lot of material to work with then.
Right, and that allows for what the book calls a discourse-based industrial history. Discourse-based? Basically, it means really delving into those rich textual sources.
Okay, I get it.
So it's not just about what they made.
It's about how it was presented.
And understood.
By
audiences over time.
And the book doesn't just take Ghibli's self-presentation at face value. Right?
Oh, definitely not. It's about understanding that those documents and stories are representations, not just neutral facts. And it draws on Barbara Klinger's work, which looks at how the identities of media and institutions shift over time, how they're shaped by cultural forces. So it's looking at both a specific moment in Ghibli's history and understanding how its perception has evolved.
Okay, so we're always thinking about, the context.
Always.
And speaking of evolving, the book also gets into some of the less talked about parts of Ghibli's work, like their use of computer-generated animation.
Right, which I think surprises some people, who have this idea of them as being purely traditional.
I can see that.
But the book actually shows that Ghibli was an early adopter of CG.
Oh, wow.
I mean, they weren't resistant to technology at all. They used it really strategically when it helped their creative goals or when it became, a necessity because of changes in the industry, like the decline of cell manufacturing in Japan.
So they weren't, totally against technology. They were just, really smart about how they used it.
Exactly. So even though they have that signature hand-drawn look, they were experimenting with and even increasingly relying on digital tools.
Behind the scenes. Interesting. And the book also talks about how Ghibli has really worked to position their films as art, right? Not just entertainment.
Oh, for sure. I mean, think about it. They have these big commercial exhibitions. They have their own museum. Their work is shown in prestigious art museums. They've really cultivated that connection to the art world.
And it's clearly a deliberate strategy, right? To elevate their work, to build a lasting legacy.
Absolutely. And as we've talked about, it's not just about the films themselves. It's about understanding all the context, the collaborations, the technologies, and the wider culture that have shaped Ghibli and, how Ghibli has shaped those things in return.
So it's this like big feedback loop.
Yeah. And it invites us to explore this whole Ghibli-verse.
Ah, love about that.
That extends beyond just their well-known films. Their short films, their advertising work, which actually takes up a whole chapter in the book.
Oh, right. I mean, we often think of Ghibli as just making these self-contained films.
Yeah.
But they've done a ton of work in advertising and shorts.
And what's fascinating is that these often overlooked, ephemeral forms of media, they've actually played this huge role in their long-term viability and in developing their brand.
Really?
Absolutely. I mean, animated advertising has been central to the industry, since its very beginnings. But scholars tend to, focus on the entertainment stuff or the art stuff.
So even for a studio like Ghibli, these little commercials and things, they weren't just side gigs. They were actually key to their success.
Exactly. They brought in money. They let them play around with their style. They even served as training grounds for future directors. And the book points out how Ghibli has kept really detailed archives of their advertising work. So, they clearly recognize how important it was.
Huh. That's so interesting. So they were thinking about their legacy from the very beginning.
It seems like it.
And Miyazaki himself directed a lot of the shorts for the Ghibli Museum.
Right. Yeah, a lot of them. And sometimes it was a way to get him out of retirement.
Oh, I've heard about that.
But it was also a chance to, train and mentor new animators. And all those smaller projects, they helped them keep staff and, really hone that instantly recognizable Ghibli style.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
And even those short DVD releases, they show how much they valued this stuff. They repackaged it for home video, made more money. It also helped expand their brand by associating it with all these different companies.
Right. And the book gives some specific examples too, like their very first ad, a sky-colored seed, and then all that later stuff for house foods, where Yoshiyuki Momo's, kind of stepped out from Miyazaki's shadow.
Exactly. And it's remarkable how often, even in their advertising, they maintain this high level of quality. It wasn't just, a quick cash grab.
Yeah, like the house foods ads?
Yeah, they had that Showa-era nostalgia, which is so Ghibli, right?
Totally. And then those Yomiuri newspaper ads with the slightly different style.
Created by Osamu Tanabe.
Yeah. It just all goes to show that for an animation studio to really thrive and last in Japan, they need these connections and multiple revenue streams.
Absolutely. Animated advertising, it's not just a side thing. It's a fundamental part of how Ghibli built its power.
Totally. And that kind of leads us to, another really key part of their story, home video. DVDs and Blu-rays.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's obviously more than just a convenient way for us to watch their films at home, right?
Right. I mean, the book really gets into how those releases are part of their overall branding and how they, shape their relationship with their audience.
Okay, yeah, tell me about that.
Well, Ghibli has been really clever about using their DVDs and Blu-rays to appeal to collectors, right?
Yeah.
Have all these extra features, behind-the-scenes stuff. It deepens the fans' engagement with the studio, with the whole filmmaking process. It makes them feel like they're getting this insider's view. Oh, like a VIP pass.
Exactly. And it's really smart as a long-term strategy.
Yeah. You want to collect all the releases.
And it reinforces, your connection to the studio.
Yeah.
Both emotionally and financially.
Right. You're invested.
The book actually draws this interesting parallel with how Pixar used their early DVDs to, establish their own identity separate from Disney.
Oh, right. And, Disney distributed home video for both of them at different times, right? So, makes sense.
Exactly. The DVD becomes like an expanded version of a press kit, blurring the lines between the film itself and all the promotional stuff.
Yeah, I get it.
But the book makes this important point that for the international market, Ghibli is mainly focused on, keeping control over the films themselves and the translations.
Okay, more than, creating new promotional content. Right. Things like voice casting and distributors trying to change the films have been big concerns for them internationally. So while the international releases do have extras, they tend to focus on, the English nubs and the Hollywood stars.
Which means they might leave out, some of the stuff happening in other markets.
Yeah, unfortunately. The book even mentions how fans were unhappy with the Italian translation of Princess Mononoke, just as an example of these challenges.
Yeah, translations are so tricky.
They really are.
And speaking of tricky, some of the behind-the-scenes stuff on those home video releases, like the ones for Tales from Earthsea and When Marnie Was There, they offer a pretty candid look at the studio's internal dynamics.
Yeah.
Like the challenges of finding people to follow Miyazaki and Takahata.
Right. It shows the tensions, the pressures of navigating those transitions. Yeah. And the book even suggests that having Miyazaki publicly endorse new directors, it can backfire sometimes.
That's so.
Well, he can have trouble switching from, this critical production mindset to a purely promotional one.
Yeah. I mean, he's such a perfectionist.
He is. And he's their biggest star, obviously. But in some ways, his very presence, his high standards, it can make things hard for new talent. Who are trying to find their own voice.
Yeah.
And the documentary footage often shows his intense scrutiny, his really high standards.
Which, doesn't always paint the most, relaxed picture of the work environment.
Right.
But even with those challenges, the book makes it clear that, Ghibli has kept adapting, even after they stopped making features for a while, back in, 2014?
Yeah. And they've explored all these, transmedia franchise things, especially in video games.
Oh, right.
And the book goes into detail about Yoshiyuki Momos, who we talked about before. He was really key in Ghibli's move towards CG, and he eventually led their subsidiary Studio Kojino. And, after Ghibli's break from features, he was really involved in that Ni no Kuni franchise, which was a huge hit.
Yeah.
So it shows you their creative influence and their style extending into other media.
And Ni no Kuni was a collaboration, right?
Yeah, with the game developer Level 5.
But the book points out that a lot of the academic work on the franchise has focused on, the Western release, not the original Japanese one.
Right, Wrath of the White Witch. And that focus has kind of hidden some of the complexities of the Japanese game industry, their structures and practices. So the book argues that we should look more closely at how it was promoted, specifically in Japan, comparing the first game to the later ones, and even the animated film adaptation.
Oh, interesting.
And even though Ghibli didn't make the games themselves, their style and their brand were really carefully maintained in Ni no Kuni, thanks to, people like Momos and Joe Hisaishi, the composer.
Yeah, the music is so iconic.
It is, and it creates this interesting tension, right, between Ghibli as this artistic ideal and Level 5 as the, the owner and creator of the franchise. It shows how their influence continues to spread even beyond their films.
So, to bring it back to where we started, with all this Ghibli AI art taking over the internet and Altman's comments about the servers melting down.
Yeah.
It's clear that Ghibli's impact is way bigger than just their films.
Absolutely. And our initial observation, about the online trend, it's so much richer now that we understand Ghibli's connections to, technology, to different industries, to global culture.
And it makes you think, right? How can a studio that's known for this, traditional hand-drawn style, not only inspire, cutting-edge AI, but also be so connected to all these technological advancements and complex systems throughout its history?
It really makes you think.
What does that tell us about, how art and technology are always changing and influencing each other?
And how they shape our global culture. It makes you wonder about other art forms that we think of as traditional and what kind of hidden connections they might have to, our modern world.
There's always more to discover, right?
Always.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.